Dun, dun, dun. I don't know, that feels like a good like spot for our folks to look for in the recording cutoff.
You're so cute,
Um,
Jesse.
oh, thank you.
I love your energy.
Well,
Energy around the
appreciate that.
exciting world of board of directors as a topic. So bring that energy, Jesse, bring it.
I will. Well, I want to also start off by saying this is a 101, so we're going to go over more basics in this. And if you have questions, please ask them. Please don't hesitate on asking about something because you think, oh, this is super basic information. People already know this, or I feel like I should already know this. We want you to ask because we are going over the beginnings and the let's get oriented with boards. And even if your organization doesn't have a board of directors because it's a LLC or a different style than nonprofit with a board of directors, this is really good information for you to have because the people that you work with are probably going to have boards of directors, and it would be really good for you to have this information if you do end up looking at transitioning into a nonprofit. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. As we are getting started, we wanted to show you some of the things that we are going to be covering. If you take a look at this slide, we have a whole bunch of stuff, and we've broken it out into generally what we plan to go over in this section of 101, and generally what we plan to go over in the 201, or our next time. Looking at the 101 side, what do you want us to cover most? If you put it in the chat, then we can scroll back up to look at it if we need to. But if you let us know what you want us to cover most, we will do our best to expand on the topics that you put. But also, if it's something that we may not have time for, or we want to go more in depth, we may move it into 201. And if you don't want to use your chat, you are welcome to unmute as well.
So I'm sorry, forgive me. I was sidetracked. I was taking notes. So did you say which, like if we want to go over any of these particular?
Yeah, on the 101 side, what is it that you want us to cover most?
Oh, I personally like to know about like donations and like conflicts of interest. Maybe fundraising would be another one that I would be interested in learning about. That's it for me.
Thank you.
I think I want to learn about what I hate the most, fundraisers. I hate begging people for money. So that's probably what I need to learn the most about.
Fundraisers are fun, Aline. It depends on what you have. Like that's what I don't know, but I don't know how to like put together a fundraiser or anything like that. But definitely donations and fundraising. Key things I need to learn about.
So yeah, intimidating.
Janet, I see your hand up too.
Yes, ma'am. The two things I would like to talk about is how to let go. And the other one is board development. Just because our policy says our board has to be 100% people with lived experience of mental health issues. And consultants and everybody else kept saying, yeah, but you need a lawyer, you need a this on it, you need a this on it. And so there's a kind of a conflict between what our bylaws say and what we're told we need on the board, and how do you fill those gaps?
Awesome, thank you. And I see people have put stuff in the chat as well. That's really helpful. I know that I've been taking notes on what people have verbally said. And so with that, I'm going to move into the next piece, and I'm going to ask a question. Why do you think we have boards of directors?
Well, you want a body that can kind of govern the organization, that kind of like draws from different perspectives. I mean, in order to make sure that you're upholding your fiduciary responsibilities and things of that nature, you have to have a strategy for your organization, and that generally comes from the ED and the board or something like that, some kind of configuration like that. So yeah, for organizational and infrastructure purposes, if you're a nonprofit, you need a board.
Thanks, Reggie. Angelina.
I was going to say something similar, like so that we can have different perspectives from different people that come from different backgrounds. I feel like when we work with a diverse community, there needs to be like certain people that understand things that other people necessarily wouldn't.
Yeah, thank you. And Janet, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, well, number one, it's required to be a nonprofit. So that's the first reason. And that's the second reason is sometimes when you're in the thick of doing things, you can't see the forest for the trees. And so the board has a little bit back off look at what you're supposed to be doing and making sure that you're following with what your mission and vision says.
Thank you. And I see the answers in the chat as well, which include to govern and support, oversight and accountability, oversight and planning, diversity of backgrounds and specialization, to govern the nonprofit, meet quarterly for the best interest of the organization. And we also have in a nutshell for you, which you guys have hit on a lot of this. We have them to take action rather than simply being informed, help design the future of agency, look at goals, what's our mark on society, people, behavioral health, recovery and peer movement, to help accomplish our strategic plan, for checks and balances, to keep the CEO or executive director and other leadership staff on track while challenging the big picture, being involved in social change, helping with critical thinking, problem solving, offering a different perspective, evaluating the organization against our goals. How are we doing? Evaluating the CEO against goals. And when operating without employees, doing the work of the organization. Shireen, would you have anything to add to this slide or to expand on?
Well, I will say, so when Jesse and I thought about doing this particular class together, we bring two very different perspectives to the same issue. So Jesse is very accustomed to a working board. So number 8 is in Jesse's wheelhouse. How do you utilize a board when you don't have employees, or you maybe are a small organization and your board has to be a very active working board? And how do you organize that and coordinate that? And what is their role in all of those sort of things? I come at this from the vantage point of being a CEO with a staffed organization. And we have had probably, I would say, 19 years, probably 8 different iterations of our board, perhaps maybe even more. And so I can share with you some of that experience around what the role of the board is. 1 through 7 are things that I had written down that were important to me or are important to me from a board that is a part of an organization that operates programs, directly serves people, has employees. And as Jesse, you said, many of these you actually either put in the chat or you said verbally. The biggest one for me is the checks and the balances. Any leadership of an organization needs to have other people that are really making sure that we are meeting and operating through the values of what we said, through our mission. And so I definitely rely a lot on my board to keep me honest and to ask the difficult questions and to help us think through the next step of the organization. I think, Janet, as you said, it's easy when you're in the weeds every single day to not look at the forest or to not even realize there's a forest there. Because your board is not in the weeds, they help you see big picture when you need it. And so, yeah, that's what I would say about this slide. Okay, so are you ready to get into some very exciting information? Yeah, my warning is that this is didactic. And without understanding this information or being able to have it in writing to reflect back on, it could be difficult to absorb all of the things that boards are required to do in the composition and how they vote and do all of those sort of things. And so we put a lot of it down in writing so you can go back. But I also would love to share with you, if you think it would be helpful, some examples from our organization of our early days and what our bylaws looked like, what a conflict of interest policy looked like, and what we do with our board. And so it is going to be a lot of information. Please stop me if something doesn't make sense or you wanted me to translate what I'm sharing with you into what does that look like on the ground, or what does that look like in operations. So there are 3 legal requirements of board of directors. The first one is called duty of care. I didn't make these terms up. They are the terms. But the first one is called duty of care. And what duty of care means is that when a board member makes a decision for the organization, they are doing so with the mission, the values, the organizational goals, and a responsibility for oversight in mind. So when you break that down, I basically put in bold some of the words that jumped out for me with duty of care, but starting with actually participating. So, and not just going to the board meetings, but also events of the organization. Really being an active participant is a responsibility directly related to duty of care. If you have board members that are not showing up, they're not meeting the legal responsibility as a board member for duty of care. You can even put a standard in place, like you'll see the percentage that I have in parentheses. You can put a standard in place around what percentage of time do you need all board members to be able to commit to participating in your board meetings and your events. The second one is being informed. It's a legal responsibility of a board member to be informed, meaning that they're reading your reports, they're reading your budgets, they are making sure that they're asking questions, they're asking information, and they're gathering information because you want them to be knowledgeable to carry out all of the duties that they have in terms of responsibility. The third one is that they are acting. So they're acting on information that they're being provided that seems questionable. This one thing can get boards and organizations in a lot of trouble. If you have a board that is just sort of co-signing what the executive director does, and you put a budget in front of them, and I'll just come up with an outlandish number, 90% of the budget is the salary for the executive director, and they are not asking questions. And something happens, like you don't pass an audit, or as a nonprofit, there's certain percentages that you want to really consider about what goes to overhead, what goes to salary, what goes to physical plant. That is good practice. If your board is not acting on information that you're providing as an executive leadership team that is questionable, then they are not following the duty to care of their responsibility. Exercising independent judgment is a part of that. You don't want your board to have groupthink. You want people to be able to question and ask and be objective and independent in the decisions that they are making in their role. You want your board to monitor the activities. So here's another area that boards and organizations can get in trouble. Your board is not there to run the agency. Some boards want to get so involved in the minutia of the day-to-day operations and details around what the decisions are being made. That is very problematic if you're an organization like ours that is very dynamic and we are having to make a million decisions in real time that may be very sensitive, time sensitive. We can't be bogged down by having to ask our board for permission, right, to operate the agency. So the board isn't there for this type of board. It's not there to make the decisions and be involved in how you're operating the agency, but it is there to monitor the activities and make sure that what we are doing is consistent with the mission and the way the organization, the purpose that it was set up for. And then, of course, it's responsible for oversight of our activities, asking information. That includes things like the legal issues. So if I have a risk, so let me bring that to a very practical example. If I have an HR risk that could potentially turn into an EEOC claim, an equal employer opportunity claim, or could potentially be a risk to the reputation of the organization. It could be a risk to our funding. Any risk like that, I'm bringing to my board. That is not something that I want to be able to handle on my own as an executive leader or an executive leadership team. This is where my board comes in. You want them to provide oversight when things are going on, whether it's a legal question, whether it's HR related, that could become a legal question, financial management. You want that checks and balances around embezzlement, around reporting and authorized and unauthorized activities. When I first moved to North Carolina, I worked for an organization, a decently large behavioral health agency that their CEO was embezzling money, and I was the whistleblower. So they had people on their board that knew this was happening. He had executive team members in the organization that knew this was happening. Somebody said something to me in passing that was, what? That's very questionable. That's illegal. And I had to make a report, and the CEO was embezzling money. The board is responsible for that, in addition to the CEO. So while the CEO actually went to prison for embezzling money, the board members had some of their own legal responsibility for not providing the oversight for fiscal management of how the CEO was operating. So let me pause there and see what you have for me in terms of questions, thoughts, comments. Anything on that section that strikes you or?
I have a question. So what if organization is run by board members? In that case, if that happens, like who is the person who is responsible then? Is that a chapter or like?
Jesse, in your experience with running the board that you did, if there were concerns about financial impropriety, who ultimately became responsible in that board?
It would follow I'm trying to use the proper terms, but it's not coming to me, but it would follow a line or an order based on our bylaws of who is supposed to take the next step. So it also depends on who it would have been. So with us, before we had any employees, if there was any financial mismanagement, it probably would have been from either the accountant or the president approving things they shouldn't have been approving, or reimbursing things they shouldn't have been reimbursing, or the treasurer not handling funds correctly. And so for each person, it would have been a different situation. If it would have been the accountant that was mishandling funds, it would have ended up being the treasurer that then has first responsibility of taking control or taking care of things. And, ultimately it would be the executive committee. That's what we called the named positions of president, vice president, treasurer, secretary. And those would be the people responsible for managing the situation with the assistance of the rest of the board members. But not every board is going to be set up that way. And there are going to be different bylaws and different structures on who is going to be next in line to handle something. And it has to be thought about when you're creating the bylaws of what structure is this organization even going to take.
Yeah, and one of the questions that a good board member is going to ask before agreeing is whether there's what they call D&O liability insurance. And D&O stands for directors and officers liability. You want to make sure that your board of directors is also covered against personal lawsuit. And any board member that understands how these things operate, they're going to insist that an organization has directors and officers liability insurance. That protects your board against personal lawsuits, and it has certain clauses in it. But that becomes one of those things that you want to make sure as a CEO, you're investing in that type of liability insurance. So the second one is called duty of obedience. And again, I didn't make that term up. That's literally what it's called. And what this legally means is the board has to operate based on a set of standards that have been agreed upon by your state and by your organization. The first one is your articles of incorporation, and the second one is your bylaws. So just out of curiosity, show of hands, how many people have written bylaws in this group? Okay, a couple folks have written bylaws. How many people have never seen bylaws at all? You don't even know what I'm talking about. Okay, several folks that don't know what that is. Okay, so we're going to do some basics. So your board has to govern the agency based on these two documents, your articles of incorporation and your bylaws, which means that they cannot make decisions that are incompatible or inconsistent with what your organization registered as a business or a corporation in your state. They have to carry out very specific instructions about managing funding, managing donations, and how they are fulfilling the organization's mission. That is typically written in your bylaws, and I'm going to go through examples of what goes in a bylaw. Okay, so that governs your board, is basically what a bylaw does. The third legal responsibility, so that's called duty of obedience. The third legal responsibility, oops, I went too many, is called duty of loyalty. Duty of loyalty. So what does this mean? This means that your board member has to act in the best interest of the organization, not themselves. So somebody had asked about conflict of interest for as an example. That's an example of a board member's responsibility for what's called duty of loyalty. So they can't leverage the organization for their own personal interests, and they cannot put their own personal interests above the organization's interests. So there's three examples on here. The first one is dealing with transactions. If you go into a transaction like a contract or a lease in which you have an interest as a board member, the nonprofit's interests come first, right? And so I can't as a board member know that Yolanda has this transaction coming up. And because I have that knowledge, I swoop in individually and say, ooh, I want to put a lease on, or I want to put a contract, or I want to bid on that myself. That's what self-dealing transactions means. So in most nonprofits, there are conflict of interest transactions that are not prohibited. So as long as you disclose your interests so that other disinterested board members can pass on the fairness of that transaction to a nonprofit. What does that mean? That means, yes, Pamela asked if we can share this. You will absolutely get these slides. This means that you can, in your board, have conflict of interest, a conflict of interest policy, and I'll show you one as an example, where people are disclosing what conflict of interest they may have. And there might be a process internally that if an opportunity comes up that the agency is going to pass on, that perhaps your board members could then individually want to take advantage of. That's what that means. The second one is corporate opportunities. So that's the same thing related to a business transaction or an opportunity that's offered by an outside party that the nonprofit would be interested in. You can't just take that for yourself. So that would be an example of taking a contract. I know that the organization could apply for this contract to do training, technical assistance, and consulting, but I'm independently from the agency a trainer. So I'm not going to share that with the nonprofit, and I'm going to apply for that contract myself. Or I'm going to put myself in a position of competing with the same nonprofit that I'm on the board of. That's what that means by corporate opportunities. And then the third one is confidentiality, confidential information. As a board member, you're going to be aware of a lot of information. The organizational information, maybe a political landscape, a bill that is coming down the pike, some unrest that is going on with funders. You're going to have access to a lot of information that could hurt a lot of people, right? And you have a responsibility as a board member to take that information, hold it in confidence, and not use it to weaponize either the organization or something that's happening outside of the agency. So that's what that means. All right, any questions about that? The 3 duties. Clear as mud? Okay, we ready to add on some other layers? Let's do it. So keeping in mind those 3 duties, what I ended up doing is putting down examples of a board member role and what their responsibility then would look like for their role. I will tell you that everything I just shared with you so far and everything I'm going to be sharing with you, we provide to potential board of directors so that they know their roles and their responsibilities. So role number 1 is oversight. We talked about that earlier. What does it mean to have oversight of an organization's finances, reputation, the organizational health, sustainability, setting the direction, and financial sustainability and stability? Well, if you translate that, their responsibility then is to ask questions, review information, request information about organizations' financial, reputable, and organizational health, and then to support efforts around developing the direction of the agency, the purpose, the goals of the organization, review, approve mission statements. If those things change, their responsibility is to do that, as well as to build financial stability of the organization. That's where fundraising comes in. Your board, you want to be actively involved in creating the financial sustainability of the organization via fundraising and perhaps some other things. That truly is a board member responsibility and a scope of practice for your board. Second board member role is strategic planning. So participating on any committees that you have, providing support and guidance to your emergency department. Your executive director, I'm working off of a three-day headache right now. I'm so sorry. I saw ED in my mind and went to emergency department. Guidance to your executive director, your CEO. Ensure effective organizational planning. Your board should be involved in your strategic planning. They may even want to have an outside consultant come in and facilitate the strategic planning process with you. But strategic planning is not something you do as an organization without your board. It is something that various members of your agency are involved in, and your board is a key role in that. And then actively participate in any strategic planning in support of the organization's goals. Being involved in agency governments, well, that means that they propose and approve any changes. So we have votes on our board. If there's something significant that needs to change, or I need a board decision, we will take it to a board vote. That is what that means. And then managing the resources effectively. you can put a standard in place with your board that any budget amendments over a certain amount has got to have board approval. When we were small, that amount was small. It was like $5,000. So me as a CEO, anything that we wanted to spend above $5,000, we would come to the board and ask for their approval. Now we're like $100,000 as an organization. So we have a much bigger latitude about our day-to-day spending and decisions that we can make without bringing it to the board. But that is part of the board's responsibility in managing the resources effectively. Providing financial oversight, you want them to review your audits, your budgets, perhaps your accrual budgets and cash flow. You want them to have a finance committee or some formal way of making sure that you have checks and balances financially within your organization, making recommendations for any accounting policies and procedures. That's all the responsibility of your board.
And if I can hop in as an
Please,
example.
anybody can jump in.
When we had somebody a long time ago, this is nobody currently with the org that I was involved with, but when we had somebody there previously that had access to the organizational credit card, we ended up finding out after a closer look that they had put their Netflix subscription on the credit card. It is something that at the time the organization's board was very overwhelmed with trying to make sure that we were still running, just continuing to go. And when we were finally able to start looking at things, that was found. And there were a couple other things that were found. And no matter how large the organization is or how small it is, you can still have financial mismanagement. And it is absolutely something that board members should be checking into.
Absolutely. And Jesse, I would say off the top of my head, I can name 8 peer-run organizations that either went away or their reputation was significantly destroyed, or funding was pulled because of financial mismanagement. And I'm not going to say it was intentional. This is part of why we do this, is understanding things like this, what the role of the board members is. This is where I say there's a knowledge equity gap. If you didn't go to business school or you didn't get nonprofit management as a part of your certification, or you don't have the history of running organizations, it is very easy to misstep and not even realize that these things are happening. And before you know it, something comes to light. There is accusation of financial mismanagement or some other issue in the organization, and the executive director and or board just didn't know. And you all know the bar for a peer-run organization is like this high, right? So we misstep, it can be very public, and it can have some really significant consequences for the peer movement. Good example, Jesse. Any questions or thoughts around this? All right, I'm going to think that means that it's clear as mud and it makes sense. Making sure your agency has adequate resources. So some of you are asking about donations and fundraising. So look at number 5. Your board of directors solicits donations, helps to organize fundraisers, secures items for fundraisers, and helps to cultivate donors. Yes, that's not just the organization that does that. As a matter of fact, if you start at the top, the board should be involved in a fundraising plan. They should help raise funds personally, have an elevator speech, and be a representative of the organization within their relationships and the people they know. They should be active in fundraising events and be a champion for the mission. They should identify prospective donors, help open those doors to those conversations, sending thank you letters, acknowledging donors, making a proud personal annual gift, we'll talk about that, and attend important public events. Those are examples of that responsibility around the organization has adequate resources. That's their role. In terms of an annual gift, it is really important for your board to individually contribute, 100% of your board to contribute to the agency. That doesn't mean it has to be a big contribution. Some nonprofits do set a standard that a board member has to contribute personally X number of dollars a year to the agency. Some of that is $5 a year. Some nonprofits say it's $1,000 a year. You can set that standard within your organization, within your board. But when you go to seek other sources of funding, there are certain sources they're going to ask, what is your board contribution percentage? And really what that question is asking is, why are we going to contribute to your organization if your board members aren't contributing? That's what that question is. And so you want to have 100% of your board contributing financially in some way to your organization. Jesse, did you find that was true with a working board as well, or how did you all handle that?
Absolutely. It was, I don't want to say even more important, but it was just as important as with a governing board, because not only is it the folks who are doing the work who are on the board, right? But it's also from the outside looking in, if you're doing the work, why aren't you committed enough to also give monetarily? And on the inside looking out, it's like, well, I'm doing the work for free, right? It's a little, wait. And also peers tend to not be paid extravagantly. So sometimes there are financial challenges to donating and contributing quite a bit. But like Shireen said, it doesn't have to be $1,000 a year, and it can be whatever works for your organization or the people who are working there. And even if it is a challenge for one person, the entire board doesn't need to know that either. The whole organization doesn't need to know that either. And that is another dynamic that comes in with the personal annual gifts. When somebody can't afford to do a lot, that's something they should be having a conversation with the treasurer or equivalent position on, and making sure that they are still able to hit that 100% giving rate, while also not causing a financial burden to the people who are helping to keep the organization afloat.
Does anybody know what your agency does in terms of personal giving requirements? Is there an amount that they set? Do they require personal giving for your board members?
It's so funny that you asked that, Shireen, because I wrote it down literally as a question to ask.
It's a great question. And so that gets to, again, why we do this. There are things I'm going to share with you that you're not going to have the answer to. If you're not involved in the organization at that level, you may not have even known that this is a thing and exists, but go back and ask your agency. What is the standard for us around A, B, and C? This also helps if you're recruiting board members. You want board members, potential board members, to know what they're getting into before they agree to be on the board. And part of that is any responsibility for making a personal gift.
And I would also want to hop in as well. A few people had mentioned fundraising as a challenge and wanting to learn more about it. And yes, we do have a topic later on about it, but there are so many different ways to do that as well. So when it talks about help raise funds and be involved in approving fundraising plan, I am very much not comfortable going up to people and being like, hey, can you give me money, please? That is not a strength of mine. And so for me, I put a lot of my effort into helping to create and organize the annual conference. That was our biggest fundraiser. And so I was able to help support our fundraising efforts in keeping that alive, rather than being the one to go out and ask for sponsorships or being the one to directly talk to people in relation to grants. We had people who that was their strength for, and there's so many different ways for people to meet these requirements. That's not just whatever your first thought is going to be.
That's right. Capitalize on the strengths and the skills that different board members have. We have board members that have no problem asking anybody for anything. We have other board members that that's not their thing, but organizing and designing a fundraiser is going to be, that's what they love to do. We have another that likes to do the marketing, the collateral materials and things like that. Different strengths, different skill sets.
Would that fall under like the delegating and making sure people are in their right things?
Lane. Yes, and that's as true for your board as it is for the team members that are working for the organization.
All right, I'm getting it.
You getting it? It takes a village. It takes a village to reach our mission, right? That's right. Okay, and then boards can review any contracts, deliverables, performance reviews, anything like that. If that's part of your board responsibility, they can do that. Evaluating the CEO. So your CEO typically works for your board of directors. People think the CEO doesn't have a boss. That's not true. The boss of your CEO is your board of directors. So they are responsible for performance reviews of your CEO. They are also, if your CEO or your executive director were to leave, the board would likely be the entity that would do a search, interview, and hire for your next executive director or your next CEO. That's how that commonly works. As a matter of fact, I think, Jesse, you all just went through that right as you were stepping away, you did a national search for a CEO and the board of directors were making the decisions, right?
I didn't, but they did.
And then the last one is political advocacy. So there is a difference between advocacy, activism. There are rules that govern certain things politically around what we can and cannot do as a nonprofit. I don't want to confuse that message because we're going to talk more about that and lobbying versus advocacy and how do you do that as a nonprofit? What are the requirements and regulations around that? But when I talk about political advocacy, it's really advocating for the mission of the agency and being a good, credible messenger for the agency's work in the public, sometimes the media, as well as support, gathering support from other people in the community. Okay, any more about that before we get into bylaws particularly?
I do want to add a point of clarity in response to a comment in the chat. The percentage of people or the percentage donating or 100% giving is not based on how much they give, but how many people give. So if all 8 out of 8 or directors on the board gives something, one person gives 1,000 and another person gives $5, but if everybody's given something, then that would be 100%. Not we have given 100% of the budget.
Okay, so 2 important things to know the distinction between articles of incorporation and bylaws. Any nonprofit organization that is in a state that requires bylaws will have bylaws. And I think you all said Texas requires bylaws for your nonprofits. States also require articles of incorporation. I'll keep this simple. Articles of incorporation are filed with your Office of Secretary to start up an agency, to start up a corporation. And it is literal basic paperwork that says who your representatives are, where you're going to be located, who the registered agent is, and the type of business structure or corporation that you're starting up. It's forms. That's what allows you to be a legally recognized entity in your state. Bylaws are more of documents that guide internally how you operate. So those are your governance documents. A lot of people don't realize when they ask, why do we do it like this? And you know, what about this? It depends on your bylaws. So there are some limitations, lots of limitations, or things that are going to direct how you do business in your nonprofit that'll come back directly to your bylaws and what is in your bylaws. So your bylaws are the processes, the rules, and the procedure of how you're going to manage the organization. And as I said, most states actually legally require bylaws. So I want to share with you some things that are in our bylaws, our original bylaws, in case you've never seen what a bylaw looks like. Ours are divided by articles. So article number 1 is the purpose and offices. That is just literally the purpose of the nonprofit, the limitations that we have as a nonprofit, our principal office, and our registered agent. Nothing exciting. It's just one of the articles in our bylaws. The second one goes directly to what we're talking about today, and that is the bylaws that govern our board of directors. So in our bylaws, section number 1 is basically declaring that our nonprofit is managed by our board of directors. Section 2 is our initial director and who that's going to be and how they're going to operate when we started up the nonprofit. So it's not even relevant to us anymore, but it's typically in your bylaws. The third one is the election, the term, and qualifications of your board of directors. So as you're trying to understand, like, how many board of directors do we have? What are their terms? When do they roll in? When do they roll off? How can you elect a board of directors? And what are the qualifications of your board of directors? It's directly written into your bylaws. I will show you ours as example. Section 4 is what do you do about chronic absences, resignation from a board member, or a termination. So this tells the board how we have to operate for a resignation, a termination, or when there's excessive absences. Section 5 is how to deal with vacancies. Section 6 is compensation of the board and whether they do get compensated. If so, what are the conditions under which they get compensated? And Section 7 is any committees that we have within our organization. So I highlighted this one because, so this was one of our early on bylaws. And this is that section that I was sharing with you. So Article 1 is simply our purpose for being established, that we are a 501c3, that we are there around mental health well-being, research, study of existing systems, identifying best practices. In the beginning, we did a lot of education and training, so that's what our bylaws looked like. Section 2 is the limitation I was telling you about, principal office, registered office. So that's the basic stuff. Article 2, however, is the board of directors. So this is the part that governs our board of directors. Section 1 is that we are going to be managed by a board of directors and committees. Section 2 was naming that I was the initial director, and what my responsibility was when I filed and started the agency. Section 3 is the election term and qualifications. So, do you see this portion here? It says the size of the board may be increased or decreased periodically by affirmative of the majority of votes. However, at any given time, we cannot have less than 5 directors to 13. So here's a tip. You want your number of board members to be an uneven number. So that's why you see 5 on the low end of 13. Why is that?
You don't want to have a tie in votes.
You got
I was
it.
just gonna say that because then you would have one extra person.
That's right. It's a voting issue. If you have an even number of board of directors and they're voting on something and they're split in half, you can't make a decision. You don't have a majority. And so by keeping your board of directors at an odd number, it helps with that. There's going to be somebody who sways the vote. basically, is what that says. For us, when we did this, each director should have a maximum of 2 consecutive years, can then leave the board for 1 full year, and then may be elected for 2 more terms. That the importance of this is to know that relative to your board of directors for your organization, the terms are going to be defined by your bylaws. How many terms your board of directors can have, what the length of that term is, if they can roll off and roll back on, the distance between them rolling off and rolling back on, that's all going to be in here. You don't even have to think about that as an executive director because it's written in your bylaws. Resignation and termination and what to do in those situations, as well as vacancies, are already in there. Compensation. So in our bylaws, it says the board of directors may receive compensation for reasonable expenses as determined by the board of directors, but in no event should the compensation exceed the reasonable value of those expenses. In addition, the determination of compensation shall be determined in accordance with our first name was Mecklenburg's Promise, as well as some other conflicts of interest. So our original board bylaws did not prevent compensation, but it needed to be reasonable based on the expenses. Ours is an unpaid board. So compensation for us does not include paying board members to be board members. This is another area that if you don't know what it is in your board of directors and you're curious, ask if you can see the bylaws or ask your executive director if they can share with you whether your board members are compensated. Can they be compensated? Can they not be compensated? And section 7 is the committee formation. So these are all the committees that we have to have on our board. We have an executive committee. We have a marketing committee. You'll see it if you read all in here, but we minimally have to have an executive committee. Section 8 is amending our bylaws. Section 9 is the power and the duties of the board of directors. Section 10 is prohibited acts. So that's all under Article 3, or Article 2, excuse me. That's what a bylaw looks like. And I'm not going to go. Oh, Jesse, can you pull up the PowerPoint again?
Yes, I can. Give you just one moment.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Shireen.
You're welcome. We know it's a lot of information and it's a lot to absorb. And this isn't necessarily the exciting part of running an agency, but we also wanted you to know what you might not know, because these are the types of things that can get you in trouble as a business if you don't know.
I got questions, let me tell you.
Are you going to go back and ask some questions?
Questions, yes.
That's great. So then they can be annoyed with me and reach out to me and say, why are you sharing this information? Because we want you to be, if your desire is to start a nonprofit, run a nonprofit, go into an executive leadership role, we want you to know this information. I did not know this information when I started the agency. I did not know. I had to learn all of this the street way.
That's where the best knowledge comes from. The best knowledge comes from there.
Uh-huh.
I will add in that in Texas, most nonprofit boards are volunteer and non-compensated, but it does not look like there is a law against compensation for nonprofit boards. That is definitely something that you would need to check into for your organization.
And does compensation mean you're compensated for expenses? So if a board member represents the agency at a conference, compensation could mean that you're able to pay for travel, room, board, all that sort of stuff. It might not be compensation in terms of a paid board member.
I'm actually very interested. I'm like learning so much, and I love that because it's building my knowledge as a person, and that way I know how things are working. Jesse, do you mind going back one on the slide so I can Yeah, where it was a board of director bylaws things. Yes, I just need to write down those second too. Thank you.
Yeah, and we've
Now,
definitely
these are
also put
ours.
the link, the document of a PDF of the files in chat file, the slides. I kept trying to say the word slide. We put the slides in
Okay.
chat, and we also are able to send it out to you afterwards
Oh,
as
I have
well.
it here. I'll just download it. I didn't know that you sent it. Sorry. I was all trying to write it down. Okay, thank you.
Keep in mind, your bylaws might look different.
Mhm.
They might not be these sections. They might have to include certain things that's Texas specific, right? So this is just one example of bylaws, but yours might, chances are it will include a lot of the same information, but it might be structured a little bit differently. Okay, Article 3 is the meetings. So there is governance around how to organize a board meeting, how to keep minutes of the board meeting, how they're stored, what a quorum is, how to have a special meeting if there's an emergency or an urgent matter that comes up, how to host a special meeting, informal action of directors. So all of that is in your bylaws. Again, this governs how your board of directors operates. Article, what are we on? 4 are your officers. So this is the number of officers, your election and your term. This is actually what we looked at, compensation. But in ours, what I didn't show you is there are sections specifically around the role of the executive director, the role of the secretary, the role of the treasurer, and the role of the assistant secretaries and treasurers for our board of directors. How to remove a board member is in our bylaws. The number of officers we need to have, that's all written down in your bylaws. So again, if you're curious, go back and take a look at it. And then the last several sections are Article 5, Article 6, 7, so on and so forth. And those are just sort of legal things that we need to have. What happens, the last article is an interesting one. What happens if your agency dissolves? What happens to any assets? How does it get distributed if your nonprofit dissolves? Yeah, Janet. I saw your hand go up as you were writing.
Yeah, I was trying to find my mute button. Yeah, it has to go to another nonprofit.
It depends. It
Ours-
depends.
Ours says
Yours
that,
in your bylaws? Is that what it says?
yeah, ours has to go to other nonprofit. It doesn't matter if it's a computer. So Goodwill's really good because it's a good nonprofit to take junk things. And we also have an agency here in San Antonio called Bare Necessities, because this is Bexar County, and it's all nonprofits belong to it, and so they're always giving away. If they're closing doors or whatever, need to get rid of stuff, they put it on Bare Necessities.
That's great. So some bylaws will say it has to go to another nonprofit that has a similar mission or the same mission. Right. Some might say it needs to go to another peer-run nonprofit. And that's where, like computers and desks and any assets need to be distributed. But it's written in your bylaws that dictates where the assets go. All right. We got through the boring stuff. Any other questions or comments? All right, Jessie.
Thanks. So some of these are going to look different on the slide, as each organization is different, right? But these bullet points have been put here for generally, what is the difference between a working board and governing board? And I will say that each working board is going to look different. Each governing board is going to look different. Each organization is different, right? But I can say from my time on the working boards that I've been on, committees are usually structured around the work that needs to be done. And executive committee or other named positions tend to have specific roles that are integral to keeping the organization running, rather than just, hey, I'm here. It's a lot harder to kind of just skirt by in a working board. And if you have a really good board, you're not going to be having anyone skirting by, right? But on a working board, you will absolutely stick out if you're not pulling your weight. Board members also may need to do the work of the organization in the evenings or in their free time, quote, free time. So the organization's working hours may not line up with other working hours of organizations that they need to work with. It's definitely interesting trying to navigate, can I actually be on this board, given that sometimes I'm going to need to be available at 11 o'clock in the middle of a weekday in the morning. Working boards are also a possible good way to start an organization if you have little to no funding. But also, if you keep a working board long-term, it can contribute to burnout of leadership in the workforce. I know we all are trying to avoid that. And on governing boards, again, these are the bullets that I put on here, and Shireen may have different experiences, y'all may have different experiences, but committees are generally structured around supporting the employees and their work, and does not necessarily take part in the day-to-day operational activities like Shireen touched on. They are responsible mostly for high-level strategy, oversight, and accountability, rather than, on the working board, the operations. Outcomes of decisions and votes guide the CEO or the executive director and the staff. And there's more time available for the directors to participate in fundraising efforts because they're not taking all of their time to run the organization.
Yeah.
There's also term limits, usually more so found on governing boards, and those will be enforced to ensure turnover of ideas and power. I will say on the working boards that I've been a part of, term limits have been a thing as well. And I would be wary of joining a board without term limits, because I find that the longer that you have the same folks on the board, the longer the same ideas are there. And in our field, we absolutely need to have new voices coming in and showing us what isn't in alignment anymore, what has changed, what maybe was a great idea at first, but now it's no longer with peer values. And especially as peer-run organizations, making sure that there's mutuality. If you stay in a position of power for too long, you are absolutely taking away that mutuality. And is that something that you want between the directors? That's another thing you have to consider. Shireen, what would you say is different from your experience with a governing board or working boards? Or
So I see we had a working board in the beginning. Our first board, when we were kind of a grassroots startup organization, we didn't have paid employees. And so we were all doing everything and trying to just get it off the ground. When we got to the point, though, that we really needed to understand things like business strategy and HR issues, you now have employees, you have audits. We had what was called, I think it was 990 Ns in the beginning, which is basically, we didn't have to have external financial audits until we got to a certain point. When we were small like that, having a working board was great, because that was all about how do we start and what's our mission and what do we want to accomplish, and like all of those beautiful grassroots energy things. When you get to the point, though, you're an operational organization, obviously there's a piece of that, but there are so many other things in play that you don't know, if you don't know, that have to be in the structure of the business and the organization for you to be able to sustain and continue. And so it definitely does shift. I find with the board of directors, somebody asked a question about what if your board of directors, your bylaws say that everybody has to have lived experience. So our bylaws say the majority of people on our board of directors have to be people that have been directly impacted by mental health. I think our first board was completely mental health recovery. The second board was mental health and substance use, and we amended our bylaws to suggest that. In order for you to qualify as an RCO, a recovery community organization, or a COSP, you have to have the majority of people on your board and in your leadership of the organization to be people who've been directly impacted. So there are some requirements outside of your state and outside of your community that determine whether you are even can be classified as a recovery community organization or a consumer operated services program. Usually it's a majority. You can, for the person who said that, 100% of your board, and then you have other people saying, but you need somebody who has a legal skill. You need somebody who's financial. You can set up an advisory group of some of those other strategists that are a part of advising your board of directors, but the decisions still land within your board of directors. So that's one way you can make sure your board of directors is 100% people with lived experience, but you're also not losing out on some of those other skill sets and knowledge sets that you need. I'll tell you, I need many people in finance. That's not my background. I know it now, I've learned it, but I still don't know everything there is to know. To have somebody who is a finance expert, either on an advisory committee or on our board of directors, becomes a really important thing outside of our agency to keep those checks and balances in place. To have somebody who understands marketing is a really important role to have on the board or an advisory group. So when you're thinking about your board, one of the biggest mistakes I see peer-run organizations make around the country is they have a board of friends, a board of people that were formerly receiving services, a board of any willing person who just wants to be on the board because they love the agency. When you get to the point where you are making some really significant decisions and you're looking at the sustainability of your organization, you want to make sure that you have a diversity of experiences, skills, worldviews on the board. And just having somebody on the board because they have lived experience or because they're a friend is a very big mistake that a lot of peer-run organizations make.
And with that, I want to move into the policies because that is also something you can have as your policy or a policy. We had in our bylaws that everybody needed to be someone with lived experience, but we didn't have that everybody had to be a peer supporter or have provided peer services. And that was pretty integral to this organization. And so we did end up going through changes with our bylaws and we were able to update a lot of things, but these are a lot of the different policies that you should be taking a look at if you are influencing policies or creating a board of directors or setting up bylaws. And there are also policies, again, policies don't have to be bylaws. Policies can be changed easier than bylaws can. Bylaws will take a really formal voting process most of the time. Some bylaws have it that you can only change it once a year or other restrictions, and others, if it's just a policy, then you can adjust it as needed for what the organization needs at that time. We had at one point somebody who was on the board who had lived experience and their partner was someone with legal experience, and that was really cool because we had that person with lived experience. They had their own pieces of expertise outside of what we were looking for with the legal aspect, but then their partner was also willing to support us every now and then without being a formal part of the board. And so we were able to keep more positions as well for people who are in the peer support community and were able to support in other ways as well. But also it could be a policy that you're not okay with that. There's so many different ways to do this. And so as we're looking at board policies, you'll need to take a look at voting structures and are you going to do motions? Are you going to do anybody can ask for a vote? We used, well, a lot of organizations will use Robert's Rules of Engagement, which you can read a book and it'll tell you all the things. I really enjoy that we called it Bob's Rules because we used a casual version of it. And so we weren't going to be upset if somebody forgot to make a motion. We would also support each other. And we would adjust it as needed. But there are other governance structures out there as well. We talked about donations and expected board contributions. Is that going to be in your bylaws or is that going to be a policy? There's conflicts of interest. Yes, there's the bylaws about that, but also what are the policies for how you're going to handle if it shows up? And I put an example of some wording there that you can see for conflict of interest policy or a document. There can be a lot more information on there. There can be a lot less. This is a fairly simple one, but if you weren't sure what it could look like, that's an idea. You also should talk about what whistleblower policies you should have. What about if it's a whistleblower who is an employee? What if it's a whistleblower that is a person who receives services? And what if it's somebody on the board? How are you going to protect that person? And what are you going to do to make sure that you can address the things that need to be addressed? And as Shireen mentioned with board compensation, it's not always just actually, are you paying this person to do work? It's what are your policies around reimbursements? Who do they send it to? Who approved it? Can any board member approve it? You have to have permission up front? What about travel for the organization? Are you okay with reimbursing some things, but they have to travel on their own? How's that going to work if you have a huge national conference that is the organization's main fundraiser? There's a lot of different things that need to go into these policies. And like we said, there are bylaws, but those are very, very structured and usually hard to change. And those are the things that you want to have as this is for the long term. And the policies, yes, they can still be for the long term, but those are things that may need to be updated more frequently. In my opinion, and some other organizations may treat the distinction a little differently, or they may put everything in the bylaws, but policies can be really helpful for managing different things that don't necessarily fit. The other thing on compensation, though, is are family members of the board members allowed to be compensated for work by the organization? That's something that could feel fairly cut and dry, but again, as we know, in the peer world, we're all entangled. We all know each other. How's that going to work? So I believe this is you, Shireen.
Okay, so board and roles and responsibilities. We already talked about this. We don't even have to go into great depth. If you see what's on the right here in terms of the role of your executive director or CEO versus the role of your board chair versus the role of your board secretary versus the role of your board treasurer, I find it to be very helpful to include this as a part of your board orientation and packet. So everybody that comes on your board is very clear about their roles and responsibilities and the distinction of their role versus your role. As a matter of fact, all of our board of directors has a job description. That's something I learned along the way. Our board of directors have job descriptions. so that there is no confusion about what they're signing up for and what their responsibility is as a board member. And it's a job description that they sign. But we also I have this list of roles and responsibilities that is included in their packet, and we go over it when they come on the board and make sure that everybody is clear about what those roles and responsibilities look like. Same thing with committees. If your board has committees, it's really helpful to be very clear about what the committees are, what the purpose of the committee is, and who is on it, and what the expected outcomes of the committee is going to be. Again, I will say to you all, I had to learn this stuff. I didn't know any of this. When somebody first told me, have a job description for your board members and have a description of each of your executive committees and who's on it and what their responsibilities are and what they should be working toward, that was a dumb moment for me. I never thought of that. Of course, that makes sense. We have it for our employees. Why wouldn't we have it for our board? This is the type of thing that helps immensely to have clarity, communication, and a lot of understanding between your board members. Finance committee, same thing. This is their role, and this is what their responsibilities are. And then I have job descriptions, roles and responsibility job descriptions for them. Funding, diversification, and marketing committee. Same thing. This gets into some of your fundraising questions. So when you're looking at what is the board role for fundraising, I have like 5, I think, here. Collaborating with your employees to develop a funding diversification plan. And it includes several things like special events and writing grants and donor development and direct mailing, solicitation, anything like that goes into your fund development plan. Working with any fundraising staff, if you have fundraising staff, to raise money, taking the lead in certain types of outreach, such as chairing or hosting an event, providing the location for an event, same things, in kind, things like that. Responsibility for all board members in fundraising. We talked about that. Monitoring fundraising efforts. And then as the funding comes into the agency, understanding the various sources and the amounts. And then on the funding side, making sure that it's appropriately documented. So our board approves any budget amendment, but they have our line item budget, so they know exactly where the money is going. Every time we have an external audit, they are involved in that process and get copies of the audit. And any response we have to our financial audit, the board knows and is a part of making that response. So here's some of my tips. Some of my tips for messing it up. Many times. Choose your board members carefully and with intentionality. Please do not put people on the board just to have a board. At the end of the day, when things start to implode, and with any organization, there's always going to be something. You're working with people and you're employing people. And what we do is messy. We choose to do it in a way that is very, very messy. Right? So things happen. When at the end of the day, you do not want, as an executive leader of your organization, to be the only one responsible for figuring out what to do. You need a board of directors that you can rely on, that when it's hitting the fan and there's a threat of this or that, you can go to your board and say, this is what's going on. These are some thoughts I have, and they will keep you in check and they will be in there with you when it gets ugly. So you need to have board members that can be in the ugly as well as in the pretty. Choose them wisely. Consider the type of board you need and the type of board you want. It has changed for us over the years. We have had boards that have felt more active. We have had boards that just wanted to sign off. We have boards that try to make our organization feel more corporate. That was a whole thing. We had boards that people just wanted to come and hang out and get pizza and shoot the shit and talk about their own personal experiences. Right? So you need to think about all of that when you are considering the composition of your board and how it's structured. So think about the type of board you want and the type of board you need. Sometimes the type of board I want is not the type of board I need as a CEO. Have uneven numbers for voting. We talked about that. I highly recommend that you have an orientation for new board members and you go through, we have a packet of information that is everything from our bylaws to our codes, any policies that are directly related to our board members, to any forms that they need to fill out, their roles and their responsibilities and their job descriptions, history about the agency, our strategic plan. That is all a part of that onboarding process that we do with new board members. I go through that with every board member personally, and then we will do board orientation in presentations. Invite board members to see the agency operate. Some of your best messengers are board members that come into the organization and they go to a class or they're a part of this and they get so excited about what you're doing. You want them to understand the agency. You don't want them involved in the day-to-day operations if you're an agency that has employees, but you do want them to be credible messengers of your organization. And so you want them to be excited. So show them what it is that you do. Have board retreats, and the board retreats can be for the purpose of just making sure the board is gelling, visioning for the future, strategic planning, whatever the case may be. And then, as Jesse says, capitalize on the skills of your board members. If I have a board member that is really good at A, B, and C, or they're a connector, or they understand policy, I want to utilize that skill as we are moving toward our strategic direction for the agency.
And for me, I would say that my main tip is if you have any influence on how you get board members onto the board, don't just take people. Don't just say, hey, you seem cool. Make sure you have a fairly robust and documented process for how people get vetted to be even considered. We now, from when I left, anytime we would go through a board recruitment process, we had two different versions of it, actually. One where we would do an open application where anybody could apply, as long as you were a member of the organization, you could be considered. And we got hundreds of people every time applying to that, which is a lot to sift through. And so we had requirements on that of you have to be a board member or a member of the organization. You have to have, the ability to speak about how your experience can benefit the organization. And we would ask different in-depth questions, and it would be like a job application. And then once we went through that first round was actually fairly easy to get through. The second round was really intense. And we asked much more detailed questions in that second application of what are these specific skills that you can bring? What are some examples of how you have affected change in your community? And really asking about those things that mattered to the organization and moving the organization forward. And on the other version, we still had the same application process, only we invited people to apply rather than having it be an open application. And even then, not everybody invited made it to the end. I'd say we invited people to apply and probably about half were invited at the end to join the board on those processes. And we would do it about twice a year based on the need. And we have a formal process at this point, but when I joined the board, we didn't. And it was a very different experience of trying to get the right people to be a part of the group. And so as the very first bullet says, make it intentional. Not everybody's going to be the right fit for your organization. And even though you may need people there to share the workload and the burden with, they still may not be the right people to do that with, which is really hard.
And the wrong person can really be devastating. Keep in mind, your executive director works for the board. They can terminate your executive director. Whether you're a founder, doesn't matter. Right? Reggie, I just saw that finger go up. And so you need to make sure that you are vetting people that have the right motives, and they're there because they want the mission to grow, and they really want the organization to grow, and to build their reach versus some personal motives, or even just some personal worldviews that are not in alignment maybe with your organization. Like the board that I had that wanted us to become more corporate. That's not a peer-run nonprofit. Yeah, Janet.
I don't know if we've done this or not, but our consultant recommended that we change our bylaws, that a founding member is always a permanent board member on the board of directors, so that even if they fired you, you would still have some say into your organization.
I would like for y'all to be a little bit more interactive at this point, because I know we just talked a whole bunch, and I would like to send y'all into breakout rooms to have a conversation with each other on what does it look like when it's going well. And I want y'all not only to talk about like in your organization, but what are examples that you've seen of when it's going well, when an organization has a board and it's just, yes, that is a good example of it is going good. I also want you to have a conversation of what it looks like when it's not going well. So y'all are going to have 8 minutes. Sorry, my setting was not letting me adjust. Y'all are going to have 8 minutes to be in the room, and you're going to have 3 to 4 people in there, and hopefully you're going to have a variety of folks in your room, so it's not all going to be people from the same type of organization. So I'm really looking forward to this, because when we come back, we're going to have a conversation about how we move forward from here. So are y'all ready? Awesome. I will see you when you get back. I'm glad y'all got to talk. I know 8 minutes is a weird amount of time, but I want us to make sure that we have this time to kind of just chat. And first I want to say that I want y'all over the next week or two, I do not remember when we're meeting next. I want you to think about how do we move forward when it's not going well? Whether you are currently on a board, whether you are currently an employee, whether you are currently leading an organization or leading a program, in relation to board of directors and succession planning, how do we move forward when it's not going well? How do we move forward when it's just time for someone to move on?
Oh, you're asking us that question?
No, I'm asking you to think about it over the next week or two. Until we meet again. Some things to also consider when you're looking at this and thinking about it. Do you have a strategic plan to fall back on for the organization, for your program, for yourself? Has the organization even worked on succession planning? Is there a clear understanding of who will step in as acting officials if someone is unexpectedly unable to fulfill the role? For an example on that one, I can say that we had, when I was the vice president, we had the president of the organization get really sick. And she was not in a perilous situation of not coming back, but she needed time off. And thankfully, we had already had those conversations and a plan of who's going to step in when that's not, when that person isn't there. And that's really important. Do you have that for the board? But also, do you have that for your organization's employees and the CEO and your program? Who's going to step in, and do they have the information that they need in order to keep things running? What do your bylaws say? Because they probably will have something there.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
How would we, what do we do if we have one person who thinks that no one else on the board is capable of keeping the board running if they're not part of it, or if they retire?
Well, I would ask, do your bylaws have anything written out on how to manage if a board member needs to be taken off the board?
It's the importance of succession planning.
And if they don't have that, and it may not be that they need to be taken off the board, but is there a process already in place for when it's not working out? Is there a process already in place in the policies if it's not in the bylaws? And if not, is that a conversation that y'all need to have as a board to look at creating policies and to look at that? And I can say that when we were looking at redoing our bylaws, it wasn't hey, everything is going off the rails and we are having a really bad time and this isn't working, right? We were in a position where we recognized that the bylaws that the organization was created with no longer fit what the organization was at that point in time. The organization had grown. And so we needed to adjust them. But it took a long time to really look at it and decide what we're going to do and how we're going to adjust it. And in that, we made sure that we had that conversation and, conversation for succession planning, but also conversation for what happens if it's not going okay with a certain director or a member. And in order to make sure that we had things written out without bringing hurt into the conversation, because a lot of us had been hurt at different points by different people, either not fulfilling their commitments or by saying something or making an assumption. We brought in other people, outside people, to help have those conversations. It was a really good conversation. We actually had a couple different people that we contracted with to help us have those conversations of what do we do and how do we change this. And I would definitely say when you're looking at bylaws, when you're looking at anything regulatory, that is definitely a place where I would suggest bringing in a consultant. Shereen, what would you say though?
So a few things to look at. Typically your bylaws will have a clause in there about removal of board members and what it takes and under what circumstances you can remove board members. Secondly is look at your terms. If you have a long-term board member, for example, that thinks that the board can't run without them and they want to be there in perpetuity, I would look at what the process is from your bylaws in terms of their terms. And, that's part of the reason why you have terms on your board is so you can't have situations like that. Thirdly, I would get a consultant. If you have a board in general that is not operating well, to have somebody from the outside, as Jesse said, come in and help in an unbiased way, unstick a stuck board and help make decisions, it might be something to think about.
And I also know that consultants tend to cost money. And if you're a working board, sometimes there's not a lot available. And so I would definitely say reach out to me individually if you need support with that. With the MHTPC funding, I might be able to help some more. And I can also give an example on that one. We had somebody who was in a named position, which this organization didn't have named positions or different job titles or roles for each director. So this was one of the named positions that was extremely important, and they just were not getting the work done. And so when we as a larger group realized that we needed to have that conversation of getting this person to not be in that position anymore so that somebody else could step in, we looked at the bylaws and we looked at what the process was. And in that moment, even though we all are very well capable and we're very capable of having this process happen and being able to bring other people through it and support others, when we were in it, our minds kind of went blank because we're the ones in it. And so we ended up looking back at our bylaws, and that gave us the step-by-step instructions on what we needed to do, in what ways, who was responsible for having what conversations based on their positions. And it was really, really helpful to have to fall back on. And I did not enjoy it. I had to be the person to have the conversation, and that was not fun. But it gave me those step-by-step instructions, and we were able to still have that person stay on the board and support in other ways. They just didn't stay in that position. And it ended up being a really great situation, honestly, where once they ended up leaving that position and we had someone else step in, and that person was able to focus more in a way that was aligned with their strengths, things worked beautifully. But it was really hard emotionally to get there, even though we are all colleagues and respect each other. So with that, this is the same slide from earlier at the beginning. And we went over the 101. I looked over the items that y'all said you wanted us to cover. I want y'all to take a look at the 201 list. And if you see something in there that you want us to make sure that we are planning for in our conversation, or something not on there that you want us to cover in our conversation for 201, please put it in the chat or email me. Again, you do have a copy of the slides, so if you're not here and you have to hop off, that is fine. But take a look at that and let us know what you're looking for. We do have your pre-course assessments. We do have all of the information that y'all gave us earlier because we've asked a lot, right? But we're asking a lot because we know needs change over time, and we are planning with the information that you give us up front. And we're adjusting to make sure that we're including the information that y'all give us closer to time as we get